Hello, and welcome to China Forum, the leading program for discussing the latest in trends and development in modern Chinese culture, politics, economics, and social issues. My name is Shannon Chiesi, and I will be your moderator for our program today. Today on China Forum, we will be exploring China's relationship with its neighbors in the Asia-Pacific region, including Japan, South Korea, and the Southeast Asian countries often referred to as ASEAN. I'm joined today by Ambassador Chaz W. Freeman, Jr. for our discussion. Ambassador Freeman is a former U.S. ambassador to Saudi Arabia and former Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs. His 30-year career in U.S. diplomacy included acting as the principal American interpreter during President Nixon's 1972 visit to Beijing, as well as serving as Deputy Chief of Mission at the American Embassy in Beijing from 1981 to 1984. He is the author of the recent book, Interesting Times, China, America, and the Shifting Balance of Prestige. Welcome, Ambassador Freeman.
Good to be with you.
I also discussed these same issues at the Brookings Institution with Dr. Kenneth Lieberthal. Dr. Lieberthal was a professor at the University of Michigan from 1983 to 2009, and he currently serves as a senior fellow at Brookings. He served as Senior Director for Asia on the National Security Council from August 1998 to October 2000 and co-authored the book Bending History, Barack Obama's Foreign Policy. We will be hearing Dr. Lieberthal's analysis as shared with me during a previous taping session at the Brookings studio. In the U.S., we tend to focus on U.S.-China relations. However, China's relationship with its neighbors will be an important part of its foreign policy platform in the coming years. China has now officially transitioned to its new leadership team with Xi Jinping as president. At this early stage, and I know he hasn't really had time to do formal policy, but what do you think we can expect from his foreign policy? Is it the new government likely to implement new strategies in the Asia-Pacific, or should we expect a more consistent approach?
Well, I think everybody in Asia, including the Chinese, is having to address a new circumstance. Asia, from an economic point of view, is now Sino-centric. China is, once again, the middle of it, and it is the place to which all the supply lines connect. And it's also politically more and more influential. China hasn't really made the full adjustment to a situation in which it is no longer poor and isolated, but now it's wealthy and powerful. Its neighbors are apprehensive about it. They are having to make adjustments. Xi Jinping, however, comes into office at a time in which China is very correctly, I think, focused mainly on domestic reform, particularly the restructuring of the economy. And it's also a moment in which the national mood is nationalistic. That's true in other countries in the region as well. So I think he will try to keep things steady with neighbors, but I would be surprised to see any major new initiatives, at least in the initial period of his time in office.
Okay. And now we'll hear Dr. Lieberthal's thoughts on this question.
I think there'll be fundamental consistency. That's in part because Xi Jinping has been involved in foreign policy actively, especially on the maritime territorial disputes, at least over the past year. So what we've seen in Chinese policy is reflected, among other things, his own very direct and substantial input. We will probably see some changes in style. Hu Jintao has been someone who does not engage energetically and personally with other leaders. He sticks very much to his talking points and keeps his own views to himself. Xi is a much more personable, lively, engaging individual. And I've found in my own experience that personal interaction can actually make a big difference in how leaders get along and what they think they can accomplish. So we may see some changes, but I think it's within a broad framework of fundamental continuity.
Currently, China's relationship with Japan has been attracting a lot of international attention. due to the reemergence of vocal arguments over the disputed territory known as China as the Diaoyu and in Japan as the Senkaku Islands. What strategies might Xi Jinping and Japan's recently elected Prime Minister Shinzo Abe use to diffuse some of these tensions?
Well, I think they're groping for such strategies because this is a very dangerous situation. Both sides have been very careful, by and large, to keep their militaries out of this dispute. They've been using civilian agencies or paramilitary organizations like their Coast Guards or the China Ocean Surveillance Agency, which is a kind of a Coast Guard. China's just reorganized its maritime forces, these civilian agencies, so that they are better coordinated and I think can be better controlled, because both sides recognize that there's a serious danger of some sort of mishap, some accident that sets off a chain of events that neither can control. But so far, they haven't found the magic key to diffusing this issue. The mood in Japan is very nationalistic under this newly elected right-wing government. And as I mentioned, in China too, the mood is nationalistic. And neither government really has a great deal of flexibility. So this is a dangerous situation. We're going to see a lot of effort made to diffuse it, but it's not clear how that will be done.
Thank you. And we'll hear from Dr. Lieberthal.
Well, first of all, let me stress this situation is extremely dangerous. Both countries now have a lot of boats in the same area, increasingly have aircraft in the same area without any rules of engagement, and where arguably none of those boat captains wants to be seen as the one that backed down and didn't represent his own country's prestige and interest fully. So this is not a good situation. If there should be an accident or incident where there's loss of life, given the high level of nationalism in both countries and the tough politics of the issue in both countries, this could change the nature of this issue very rapidly. So something really needs to be done. I think that likely the first steps will have to actually be at a non-governmental level. I think the two governments still have a difficult time engaging each other in a serious way on this issue. But there are elders in both countries who know each other well, who have been friends for many years, who command the respect of the current leadership in both countries. I think they ought to engage. They ought to figure out what steps each side can take unilaterally, but in a coordinated fashion, and build confidence on both sides by having each side step back in a measured way, not a big way that would affect matters of face, but in a measured step-by-step way, until perhaps this summer or a little later the governments can engage to try to get something more formal that reduces dramatically the chances of incident or accident. The reality is that the sovereignty issue itself will not be resolved for many, many years. So what needs to take place is a kind of development of a new status quo that largely eliminates the chances of conflict, even though it doesn't resolve the underlying tensions over this issue.
This dispute with Japan and other territorial disputes have been around for decades, but it seems like recently there have been many more arguments and confrontations over them. Is there some sort of underlying cause that would explain why all of these different disputes are now coming out into the open? And if so, is there any way to address this root problem?
Well, I think there are two issues that are basically behind the flare-up in territorial disputes. The first is that for the first time in centuries, China actually has the capability to enforce its claims. And the second is that countries in the region also have been modernizing their naval forces, their coast guards, their oil exploration companies for offshore activity. And they have been extending their sovereignty into the areas that they claim, which overlap with Chinese claims. So we have not a case of China being the only one that is nationalistic, the only one that's expanding its power and influence. We have an Asia in which wealth and power are being quite widely developed, and in which maritime issues are now the subject of conflict because these countries which previously didn't do much are now beginning to do a lot in the maritime space.
And once again, we'll go to Dr. Lieberthal.
I think actually these tensions over each of these disputes is reflective of developments in each party to the dispute. So it's not all simply, well, if only China did X, all of this would become much better. There are a lot of particularities to each of these disputes. I do think also that part of this is that China's own capabilities and presence in the maritime areas in the East China Sea and South China Sea are growing. And as that presence grows and as concerns about Chinese capabilities increase, that also affects the level of tension over disputes. So there are a number of factors contributing to this. I think the kinds of approaches in the South China Sea are going to have to differ quite a bit from the approaches in the East China Sea. So I don't think that there's a kind of panacea, a key step that could be taken that would produce dramatic results all around. But clearly each of these needs to move more into a negotiating track with agreement on the parameters of the negotiation and involve less what it currently involves, which is a lot of things happening in each of these areas and a lot of unilateral declarations in each capital, none of which are reducing the tensions or resolving the issues.
These long-standing territorial disputes between China and now some of its Southeast Asian neighbors, like Vietnam and also the Philippines, have started to really have an effect on regional diplomacy, especially at the ASEAN forums. What do you think this will have to say in the future for ASEAN, and is this going to affect China's overall regional diplomatic efforts?
Well, so far, China and Japan, Korea, ASEAN have managed to insulate their economic relationships pretty well from these disputes. There's a difference, perhaps, in the case of Japan, in that there's a popular boycott of Japanese products in China that has cut probably 1.25% off Japan's growth rate and pushed it back into recession. But generally speaking, everybody's still talking. Japan, Korea, and China are about to meet very shortly to discuss a free trade zone, the free trade zone between ASEAN and various countries, including China, India, Australia, New Zealand, and so forth, and Japan, is going forward quite well. And so they have managed so far to separate their economic interests from these troubling nationalist problems. But we are in a situation in which ASEAN is being split by these disputes. Some countries in ASEAN, particularly Cambodia and Thailand, are not interested in Burma, Myanmar, not interested in involving themselves in disputes with China. Others, Vietnam, the Philippines, perhaps Brunei, although they're pretty passive, Malaysia, actually have disputes with the Chinese. And you have Indonesia emerging as a very major force trying to compose differences between them all. So this is having an impact, as your question suggested, on the structure of relationships in Southeast Asia as well as in Northeast Asia.
And once more, we'll hear what Dr. Lieberthal has to say.
Well, you have a somewhat surprising set of very contrary developments occurring throughout the region. On the one hand, the level of regional economic integration is accelerating, and that regional economic integration has China at its core. There's not a country in the region that doesn't see deeper engagement with China's economy as one of the key elements in its own long-term economic growth plans and prospects. So that is proceeding apace. At the same time, traditional security issues are also growing. These are issues over things like territorial boundaries and rules of engagement. And obviously they go in the opposite direction from this economic engagement. At present, the two have not seriously affected each other. In a minor way, you see China taking some economic retaliatory measures against the Philippines last year. Certainly some impact on Japan, China, trade and investment since last fall. But this has been relatively small scale. My concern is that in the future, it is possible that these traditional security issues will really become a significant obstacle to realizing Asia's economic capacities, the capacity to be rapidly growing and technologically dynamic. That's important to all of us because, frankly, the whole world now depends on Asia as an economic engine. And if that engine slows dramatically, all of us will suffer. So I think the territorial issues and the diplomatic issues have kind of existed in their own sphere, have not had a huge spillover effect to date, but clearly that is an issue that could change in nature, and if so, the consequences will be very widely felt, not only in the military side, but also more broadly in Asia's economic role.
There's one of China's neighbors that we haven't yet discussed, and that is South Korea. South Korea also recently underwent an election with new President Park Geun-hye, and I think both Xi and Xi Jinping would like to work together, keep the relationship going and expand it. However, the problems with North Korea, especially given the recent nuclear test, could have an impact on China-South Korea relations. How do you think they will balance the need to improve their relationship while also having very different strategies towards dealing with North Korea?
Well, there's a real question about how different those strategies are going to turn out to be. The United States and South Korea essentially have looked to China to keep North Korea from doing really crazy things. The Chinese have found that a very frustrating, even exasperating task, and they haven't really succeeded, and they are exasperated. And I think there is a lot of discussion in China now, not about abandoning North Korea so much as downgrading the relationship with it. China's relations with South Korea are excellent. This isn't really a zero-sum game. And I note that President Xi and President Park have exchanged several telephone calls and sent emissaries back and forth. And if anything, perhaps North Korea's misbehavior gives South Korea an opportunity to improve its relations with China.
And once again, we'll hear what Dr. Lieberthal thinks.
Well, let's keep in mind, South Korea's trade with China is now far larger than the combination of South Korea's trade with Japan and with the United States. There are more students from China in South Korea than from any other country there. And I believe more South Korean students go to China than South Korean students go to any other place for foreign study. There is no comparison between China's relations with North Korea and with South Korea. This is diplomatically, economically, in almost every way. But China is determined to preserve the North Korean state as a strategic buffer. And that obviously puts it not so much at odds with South Korea. South Korea doesn't, or at least very few South Koreans think that a collapse of North Korea is in South Korea's interest. The costs of that and the potential dangers from it are huge. And so what most South Koreans want is an evolution of the North Korean regime. That's also what China wants. The problem is no one, South Korea, the United States, China, Japan, knows how to produce that. Each goes at it in their own way with somewhat different priorities, but also different perspectives on what will work most effectively. And so that does cause frictions, and it does, in some ways create diplomatic issues. But at the end of the day, the Chinese-South Korean relationship is a very powerful relationship at this point.
Now for our final question, let's turn to more specific U.S.-China relations. The Obama administration has maintained its intent to rebalance towards the Asia-Pacific, both economically, diplomatically, also militarily. As the U.S. tries to expand its influence in the Asia-Pacific, while China is trying to do the same thing, a lot of people are expecting there to be a rise in tensions. Do you see this happening, and are there ways that the U.S. and China can control these tensions?
Well, there are a lot of issues. Let's begin by noting that we just went through an election campaign about 6 months ago in which China bashing was the favorite sport of politicians. This means that President Obama has come into office with some sort of commitment to be tough on China. And Xi Jinping is leading a country which is not in a particularly compromising frame of mind with regard to the United States and the issues we pose, including the so-called pivot or rebalancing. So he too is inclined to be tough. So we have a less compromising American president dealing with a perhaps less flexible, more nationalistic Chinese leader, and there are bound to be tensions. The pivot, or the rebalancing as it's been renamed, is quite problematic in this regard. First of all, it's not clear that it's real. The United States remains bogged down in the Persian Gulf with a lot of talk about war with Iran. How can we pivot out of that theater into East Asia? Where are the forces? Second, the United States, in case people haven't noticed, is in financial difficulty. We are suffering from fiscal fibrillations. We have undergone a radical bit of surgery on our budget, indiscriminate surgery, which has hit the Defense Department pretty hard. And defense programs are clearly going to go down in the future, not up. So where are the additional forces for that? Third, part of the rebalancing, intelligently I think, is to try to take advantage of Asia's economic rise through the negotiation of a Trans-Pacific Partnership. But that's very problematic because the content that we have put forward as our agenda in the negotiations is really not very interesting to others in the region. It represents American special interests more than their interests, and it's not clear the negotiation is actually going to succeed. More particularly, TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, excludes China. And yet, as I said at the outset, China is now the center of the Asian economic structure. Indeed, in some ways, it's increasingly at the center of the global economic structure. And if you exclude it, it won't work.
We'll hear from Dr. Lieberthal one more time.
I think our strategy is, in fact, region-wide. I think that the fundamental goal of the strategy is to shape the Asian security environment so that it does not disrupt Asia's long-term economic growth and dynamism, with the U.S. fully participating in and benefiting from that economic growth and dynamism. That's the goal. China has to play a major part in any Asian regional strategy, and it does in this. But the strategy is not directed against China. It's a regional strategy that actually involves numerous efforts to build bridges to China. The Chinese have tended to see this strategy more as directed against China and is aimed at constraining, complicating, and potentially eventually disrupting China's rise. And they've been responding to it within that kind of policy analytical framework. That makes things very difficult, because when they respond that way, then traditional security issues grow around the region. The U.S. gets drawn in more fully on the security side than we would like to, with more of a hard edge on the Chinese dimension of those security issues than we would prefer. So there's a kind of feedback mechanism here that can lead from good outcomes to outcomes you really don't want. My own feeling is that the U.S. now should think through whether there's a way to rebalance the rebalancing strategy, which is to say, while maintaining full assurances and actions to back them up to our friends and allies throughout the region, nevertheless engage with the new Chinese leadership in a fashion that deepens mutual trust, especially mutual trust over long-term intentions. How we do that is frankly too involved for a brief answer to your question here. But among other places, you can read my thoughts on it on the Brookings website in an essay called Bringing Beijing Back In.
Ambassador Freeman, thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you to Dr. Lieberthal as well for joining us previously. Thank you to our audience, and we'll see you next time on China Forum.